shall show me the whole of the law.
Love the law, love and will.
Well, I also want to repeat what Beth said in terms of thanking you so much for coming tonight. I have really bad anxiety driving, and so this was like a nightmare getting over here. And I was thinking, well, if I'm having a bad time getting over here, I can't imagine how everybody else is going to get here. So I'm really glad that you're all here tonight. Yeah, I'm very new to Blazing Star Oasis. I've only been a member for not even a full year, and very new to Thelema. And so I come in from a pretty different background in terms of my area of knowledge, of expertise, if I can call it that, even though I don't really consider myself an expert. A lifelong student of comparative religion, comparative mythology, and more recently, comparative esoteric systems. And I certainly have a lot of knowledge around Swedenborg and Jung. And when I started to study Crowley and started to talk to Thelemites and read a bunch of literature, I started to find a lot of parallels between these three thinkers in particular. And I'm sure for some of you tonight, some of this information will probably be like, yes, we already knew this information. But I'm hoping to enlighten some folks who maybe don't know anything about Emanuel Swedenborg in particular, haven't really thought about the comparison between different systems and the importance of the symbol of the sun, which I know is ironic considering the weather tonight, but we can visualize a really bright sun. Maybe that'll help us. And also Carl Jung. I asked Ben if folks usually, when they do classes, have the questions at the end or intersperse, and I would like to have it interspersed. So if anybody has any thoughts throughout my talk, please feel free to raise your hand and let me know. I appreciate any sort of input. Another full disclosure, I'm getting over a really bad flu. So I'm armed with tea. I'm not contagious, but I just want to let you all know that I'm not 100%. And so I might be a little slower than I usually am. So the first place I'd like to start is Emanuel Swedenborg, just in terms of chronology. So Emanuel Swedenborg was born in 1668, he died in 1772. I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of Emanuel Swedenborg? Okay. How many of you have read anything by Swedenborg? So yeah, he, usually when I tell folks, one thing about my own spiritual affiliation is that I do consider myself a Thelemite, but I also consider myself a Swedenborgian. I'm also a Freemason, and I am an aspiring Jungian psychotherapist. So needless to say, I'm confused. No, but I wear many hats, and I gain a lot of sustenance, spiritual sustenance, from being involved in all of these different systems. But usually when I tell people I'm a Swedenborgian, they just go, Sweden what? Most people have no idea who Swedenborg was and what Swedenborgianism is. So Swedenborgianism is a sectarian, technically is a Christian denomination that was started after Swedenborg's death in 1772. It's definitely not mainstream by any stretch of the imagination. It would probably be considered heterodox. That would be the most polite word that would be used for it. Heresy, heretic, would probably be a stronger word that would be used for it, because it varies so drastically from what would be considered Orthodox Christian theology. But Swedenborg grew up in Stockholm, Sweden. He was the son of a Lutheran bishop who was very famous for the time, very popular. And Swedenborg had the highest level of education. At the age of 13, he was essentially the equivalent of having like a bachelor's degree. I mean, he was very intelligent. And when he graduated from university, he engaged in the study of multiple areas. I mean, the list of the different sciences, humanities, social sciences that this man was involved with and was studying and publishing is tremendous. Everything from astronomy to biology to anatomy. And so he was well known in Europe. And still, if you go to European universities, he is cited as being sort of the founder of many, innovator in terms of anatomy and an inventor, sort of like a Da Vinci, designed like a flying machine and cool things like that, submarines. So he was known as being very much an Enlightenment man, someone very rational. Not a lot of evidence to suggest that he wasn't religious outside of the norm for his time. But around 1743, he starts to have these profound spiritual experiences. And this is the theme that we'll see with all three men tonight, is that they were struck by a very profound shift in their lives in terms of a spiritual experience. For Swedenborg, it was very profound because he believed that the divine was telling him that he was supposed to be writing a series of writings that would be heralding a new age, and that the old forms of Christianity were going to be dying out, meaning Catholicism and Protestant denominations. And so he starts at first writing in a dream journal. And this is how his spiritual experiences began. And he started writing these dreams that were really profound, and he was trying to understand them. And then he actually had visionary experiences where he claimed to be seeing the divine, and then he claimed that he was seeing the other world, the spiritual world, which he perceived as being heaven and hell in a sort of neutral place called the spiritual world. And so he begins writing all these texts, and his main texts take up about 30 volumes of writing, theological writing, and they outline his theological opinions about things that would be very understandable to Christians. Like he talks about the Trinity, life after death is a huge theme for Swedenborg. But by the end of his life, near the end of his life, he was accused of heresy because of his views. Namely, he preached a very universalist aspect to salvation. So he believed that the divine is not this judgmental deity that's like this father figure that's going to spank people in the afterlife for all eternity, but rather based on how we live our lives, we essentially arrive at a state in the next life that is consistent with how we lived in this life. And so right now, living in this plane of existence, you might say you're living a heavenly life, whatever that might mean, or a hellish life, whatever that might mean. And he also did not believe that the Trinity was three divine persons, but one being manifesting itself in three ways. So you can see where this would have gotten him in some heated areas with traditional Christian theologians. He also rejected predestination and really thought that free will was the big thing for our existence. In 1763, he writes one particular text called Divine Love and Wisdom. And this text is very important because he devotes a whole chapter to the major symbol for tonight, which is the sun. Swedenborg has been characterized as being a Neoplatonic thinker, and so he does believe in this concept that is very at odds with perhaps creationist Christians, that God doesn't just snap his fingers and suddenly poof, we have everything, and it's such a personal engagement, but rather through emanations we have existence brought forth. And Swedenborg, in his writing of Divine Love and Wisdom, claimed that the first celestial emanation of the divine is the sun. And that there is a sun in this reality, as there are suns and stars throughout the entire cosmos, but that in the spiritual world, there's also a sun. And that the sun radiates what he said was divine love and wisdom, which is essentially the essence of existence. And so he makes it clear that the divine is not the sun, but it is the first emanation from the divine. And the way we tap into this love and wisdom is by understanding the deeper layers of our own selves and really thinking about how we're living our lives. So yes, he does have some old school morals as well. Some of his ideas about ethics are certainly outdated, but many modern Swedenborgians have been able to take his ideas and really put forth, living what might be considered a positive life and what might be considered a negative life. Of course, there's a lot of debate of what that even means. Another thing when I tell people that I'm Swedenborgian, especially when I'm here at Blazing Star Oasis, a number of fellow members have said, "Oh, isn't Swedenborg's one of our Gnostic saints, isn't he?" And I have to say, no, that's Swedenborg, not Swedenborg. So there is that misconception, which I've heard from a few people. But Blake is one of our saints, and Blake was heavily influenced by Swedenborg. Blake read Swedenborg and studied him in great detail, especially 5 of his major works, and actually there's evidence to suggest that he signed up to be one of the earliest Swedenborgians, sectarian Swedenborgians. But Blake, being a free thinker himself, he didn't really like the way that the church was making Swedenborg's ideas into a dogma, into a strict doctrine. And so eventually he left the Swedenborgian movement, and as evidence from his poetry, he sort of had a love-hate relationship with Swedenborg and his ideas. You can see that he likes some of the things that Swedenborg says, but he's critical of other things, and he's also critical of the people who are now claiming to be Swedenborgians. And the idea of dogma, or debating about dogma and doctrine, is something that modern-day Swedenborgians still wrestle with in the different branches that exist. But Swedenborg really thought that the sun was this most important symbol to visualize the divine, or visualize the divine spark that is in each person. Any questions so far? Oh, yeah.
How much did his knowledge overlap with, like, say, knowledge of the Tree of Life? Was any of his writings concerned with those emanations in general, or was he completely parallel to that line of thought?
So there's a lot of debate about how much he read before he started writing his theological idea, like how many ideas really was he exposed to. So I do know for sure that in his library there were Hermetic texts. So he was familiar with certain Hermetic texts. I'm not exactly sure which ones. And this is something that the more conservative branch of Swedenborgianism has tried to actually really underplay and suppress. The idea that he could have read other things that would have influenced his ideas. I do believe that he studied with his brother-in-law, and I forget his brother-in-law's name. I think it was Lebens. And I believe Lebens was a reader of Kabbalah and was very familiar with the Tree of Life. And I mean, it would have been too strange because they spent so much time together that they would not have had a discussion about these things. I mean, they must have. But again, it's sort of like the different branches of Swedenborgianism. The one that I belong to is the much more liberal, progressive, critical thinking. And I'm sure since this is going on the internet, so someone from the conservative branch might take exception to what I just said. But much more of a willingness to say that yes, he probably was influenced by other things. And I personally really like that idea, and I'm going to touch on that theme more about, sort of shared exposure and sharing of ideas as we move forward. Any other thoughts? Okay. Boom, the sun. Right, so the divine sun, essentially, Swedenborg takes it as being true reality. So he comes up with this idea of correspondences. And correspondences is a word that he coins. I'm not sure what it is in Latin, but he uses it in a very particular way. And he wrote all of his works in Latin, by the way. And so correspondences, what he means by this word is to say that everything in our physical reality corresponds to something in the spiritual reality. So literally everything that we see externally, everything that's inside of us, our physiology, all of it corresponds to something spiritual, something psycho-spiritual. And so if you're engaging in a ritual, if you're engaging in a prayer, in a meditative moment, if you're just engaging in the pleasures of life, you're corresponding to something that's actually real in the spiritual world. So again, this is a very sort of Neoplatonic, Platonic idea. And so again, the idea that the sun gives out love and wisdom is that if you're engaging in love and wisdom, you are linking up to this source, which is the divine sun, the first emanation, which is the divine itself. And by doing this, you're engaging what he calls the process of regeneration. And this is something that we'll find this sort of process of transformation that Swedenborg talks about as regeneration. We'll see later that Jung talks about it as individuation. and Crowley really, having a conversation with your holy guardian angel, or discovering what is your true will, what is connecting to your greater self. These are all parallel processes, but they're describing it in different ways. So for Swedenborg, it's a little bit more of a veiled in Christian language. So the first step, it's a 3-step process. The first step is what he calls this repentance, which I know has a lot of baggage. But repentance, for Swedenborg, he took it from its linguistic root to mean turning away. So it's not meant to be shame or guilt, which is what I think in more Orthodox Christianity, I think it's become more of this view of being shame and guilt-ridden. But for Swedenborg, it's more of recognizing that something's not working for you. You keep getting in the way of yourself. And so you turn away from those things that are getting in your way of growth. From there, you enter into a phase called Reformation, where you're struggling now. I mean, this is a back and forth. You may recognize that things are getting in your way, but maybe you still indulge in some of the things that are getting in your way, but you remind yourself and you go back. That's sort of the going back and forth phase. And then finally, when you're regenerated, you've successfully, at least for the most part, overcome the things that were getting in your way. But to be clear, Swedenborg does not believe in the concept of a perfect person, in that regeneration is a lifelong experience. This is not like, tomorrow I'm going to walk in here and go, I'm regenerated, guys, and then that's like, woo, yay, and that's the end of it. This is a lifelong journey. And in fact, in his theological opinion about Jesus, which again would be considered probably very blasphemous to certain groups of Christians, he believed that Jesus grew and experienced this same process just like everybody else. And so he experienced the same temptations. He was not a perfect person. And in fact, his life was not meant to be a payment for the atonement of any sin, because he rejected the idea of original sin. But rather, his life was to be an example of the process of regeneration. So Jesus' life is meant to be like an archetypal pattern or archetypal narrative for people to follow in terms of this process. Any questions on that? So he made some interesting comments about Egypt, and I'm aware that it was a fashion in the 1700s and 1800s to project back onto the Egyptians a lot of things that we assume. We might have certain beliefs now, and there's a lot of projection back to the ancients. And I know some of my fellow Freemasons like to think that Freemasonry, without question, goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, and that's been criticized in terms of historical veracity. I don't believe that, but there's some Freemasons who are very convinced of that. And so Swedenborg, he himself doesn't say that his ideas can be traced back all the way to the Egyptians. But something that he has in common with Crowley and also with Jung is this notion that human life passes through ages, aeons, huge periods of time. And for Swedenborg, he calls them churches, but really they're ages. And certainly it's not to say that they're all Christian churches or all Judeo-Christian churches, but he refers to the most ancient church and says that there's a group of spiritual people, they had certain beliefs, and that they were really in tune with the idea of correspondences. So it was symbolism. And they understood the language. And then in the second phase, the second age, they started to look at the correspondences or the symbolism more literal, and started to worship the imagery as opposed as an actual object of worship as opposed to what they stood for. And the third phase is sort of the beginning of monotheism. Fourth phase, traditional Christianity. Fifth phase, the age we're in now, the New Age. Again, there's not a lot of historical evidence for anything I just said, but there's a lot of discussion about sort of just the development of spirituality in general, and whether that's just a metaphor for how people might arrive at spiritual ideas. But one thing that he does say, and could be debated, is he's convinced, he states this in an address in 1744. He says that if you want to understand the Egyptian hieroglyphics, you have to understand correspondences. So in his opinion, the key to unlocking the mystery of the hieroglyphics is to understand that it's a symbolic language, and that everything you see in the hieroglyphic language is a symbol that stands for something that's probably spiritual. That's what he says. And we can debate whether that's accurate or not, but that was his opinion, something that he states in 1744. But because he made that statement, there have been Swedenborgian scholars who have tried to find correspondence within ancient mythology. And so one Swedenborgian reverend wrote a whole book called Correspondences in Egypt, and where he breaks down all of the Egyptian mythology and the symbolism to correspond to spiritual principles. So for example, he says that Ra is the spiritual sun, that the sun disk with the snake around it is love and wisdom, and that there are three manifestations of Horus. Horus the elder, Horus in action, and Horus the infant, which corresponds to what Swedenborg would say is how the divine corresponds as being the unknowable deity, the manifestation of the deity, and then the interaction or the process of the divinity in time and space. Again, I don't think that everyone is quite sold on this, but this is just something that some Swedenborgians have encountered when they've been doing comparative religious studies. Questions about that or any thoughts? Yeah.
Can you go back to the hieroglyphics
Sure.
as correspondences?
Yeah.
Because if the written word or hieroglyphic refers to something in the spiritual plane, I mean, isn't any written word sort of the same thing? It's this construct where we all agree that certain things mean something, but they're invisible. I was wondering if you could kind of describe if that was his view or if it was something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're on the right track with pointing that out, and I think that, I think really what he was trying to say is that this was evidence that the Egyptians were using what he believed, what is the function of correspondence. So you're engaging with images to remind you of something that's transcendent, or something that's deeper, something that's within you. And so I think it was his opinion that that's what the function of the hieroglyphics were.
Not just to tell a story.
Right.
Okay.
And certainly story is really important. I mean, again, that is something that can't be stressed enough, that he doesn't see, Swedenborg himself did not take the Bible literally. Again, this is where I might run into some issues with conservative fundamentalists. So for example, Genesis, the 7 days of creation, not literal at all. It's actually the process of human psychological growth. And even the apocalypse. Book of Revelation, again, very controversial. Ben made the joke, it's the apocalypse outside, and how many literalists have said this is the end times. Well, Swedenborg completely goes around that by saying, the apocalypse is purely symbolic. It's been written in correspondences, it's not meant to be taken literally. And so, that is something that I think makes him, at least unique with regards to how he unpacks the symbolism of the Bible. Of course, not really unique in the history of people who've studied the Bible, because a lot of Jewish and Christian scholars did not interpret the biblical text literally, but a lot of people either aren't aware of that or don't want you to know about it. Right? It's not the loudest voice. But yeah, I think the hieroglyphics, I think that it wasn't just a narrative. Of course, the narrative is important, but it's what's the deeper message beneath the narrative. So I hope that answers the question. Any other thoughts? So one thing that struck me, and again, I've only been involved with studying Thelema for not even a whole year now, I think, and so I'm very much a novice. But I was very stunned by the parallels that I was finding with my limited exposure thus far to reading Crowley to reading Ben's books, and I referenced Ben's books in this talk, and I asked him if that was all right. He said yes, he trust me, I wasn't planted to help sell his books. His books are great, but I was just struck by the parallels, and was just anyway. I'll get to that more and more, but seeing Crowley proclaim every man, every woman is a star, and that the sun, as Ben mentions in one of his books, that the sun is a symbol of enlightenment. And this is something that Crowley felt, that the symbol of the sun was a symbol of enlightenment. It was a source of power and force, center of our soul, symbol of the various forms of Horus, and symbol of the mystical path. And so this struck me as pretty profound in terms of a parallel, and it's really talking about the mystical path. So really, my takeaway from my limited exposure to studying Thelema is really having a spiritual path or a mystical path that really gets you to understand the deeper parts of yourself. Something that I don't think a lot of systems really encourage people to do. In my previous experience, I was raised Roman Catholic, and then I converted to Islam in 2007, and I left Islam in 2012. And so there's a lot of systems out there that really don't emphasize turning within. And one thing that really strikes me as profound about Crowley's philosophy in particular is this notion of turning within and inner exploration, and really using symbolism to help with that as a tool. So really using symbols to help someone explore themselves. And I'm going to say more about this parallel between power and force, or energy, whether it's spiritual energy or psychological energy. So I think the first time I attended a Gnostic Mass was here, and I didn't consider myself a Thelemite at the time. I was brought here by my friend Tom, who's sitting in the back over there. And one thing he told me about it was, "Are you okay with some nudity?" I said yes. He's like, "Okay, that's all you need to know." That's all I knew. But what struck me was the language, especially, again, the symbolism that I thought I understood what was going on. Of course, every time I go to Mass, I think I'm picking up on something new. Maybe I am, I don't know. And the more I research it and read about it, it unpacks more and more. And so I was really struck in this context by this part of the creed. And the idea that, according to some of the literature that we have out there that is sort of a commentary on the creed, that you have the symbol of the sun or a star representing a manifestation of an ineffable divine energy, whatever you want to call it, something that's beyond us, and that the star in the symbol is something that is an image that we can meditate on, stands for something, but that we ourselves can interact with this energy that comes forth, just like how the sun nourishes the physical world. We have something that is nourishing us in a psychological way. And I think that that's really important. And when I first experienced the Mass, and when I first started reading about the deeper symbolism of the Mass, I could see that there was this parallel between what Crowley had written and the way that Jung, for example, talks about the symbol of the sun, which I'm going to be talking about a little later. Any thoughts, or any questions, or input? So, in Ben's book on the symbolism of the Mass, one thing that he really talks about is the sun being a representation of the phallus, chaos, this raw energy. And he has an excellent chapter in his book where he talks about magical energy. I'm really trying to understand, like, what is that? What is magical energy? And one thing I do appreciate about Crowley and also about Ben's writing is that, again, there isn't really this emphasis on, well, it's obviously this, and that's the end of the discussion, right? There's no dogmatic statements being made. It's sort of a question of, well, it might be this, or it might be this. But really the most important thing is it's an experience, something that we experience. And so during the Mass, there is some sort of energy that's created, that at least is the intent. And it could be prana, it could be life force, kundalini, so it could be sexual energy. But really, it's union of opposites. Abarex, the Father, the Son. That's an illustration of Abarex there. And so I honestly, for the longest time, had no idea that this particular image or deity or whatever, this symbol, I had no idea that this was invoked in the Mass. I did not know that for the longest time. And was pretty amazed to discover that it is mentioned in the Mass. But going back to the energy that's created, I personally have definitely experienced some sort of communal energy as a result of the Mass. And I don't know if that has anything to do with it's not just the imagery of the sun, obviously, but obviously all the images that are being invoked. But I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on this in particular. Any sort of thoughts about energy experienced or experience of the Mass in general?
Well, where's that image from?
Where is this image
That
from?
particular image.
I'm not entirely sure. Just rip that straight from the internet. I'm not entirely sure. I know that some of the more ancient depictions, some have been found on some inscriptions. I don't know if it's even coinage in the Middle East in particular, but this I think is a more modern artistic rendering of the image. But the image you typically looks like that in even the most ancient depictions. So I found myself really interested with, like, what is this energy? And I know I honestly don't mind stepping back and forth between spiritual energy, psychological energy, but that's just me personally, you know. And I think some folks might be more inclined to think about spiritual energy. Some people might be more inclined to think about psychological energy. I kind of do this back and forth dance with myself. But I think Crowley leaves it open for each individual to kind of decide, like, what does that mean to you as an individual? But Jung mainly talked about it as psychological energy. And so this is going to be a very quick synopsis of Jung's life. But how many of you have read much of Carl Jung? Okay. So he was another late 1800s baby. And at a really young age, Swiss, and at a very young age, had these profound childhood experiences where he had these really profound dreams and visions. Some of my favorite is he had a dream of God taking a gigantic crap on a cathedral.
That was
True story. And you know, his father was a priest. His mother was more of a medium. I don't know if she studied the occult, but she definitely, you know, if she was alive right now, I would probably put her in the category of, like, alternative spirituality. She definitely was not a mainline whatever. But his father was a Swiss pastor. And so he grew up being exposed to these sort of uncanny moments, but also having a father as a pastor who taught him traditional religious education. But he had doubts his whole life in terms of the metaphysical veracity of any of these ideas. So he becomes a psychiatrist, and right before World War I, actually several years before World War I, he begins a correspondence with Sigmund Freud. And Freud was impressed with Jung's writings on schizophrenia and the association tests, which he developed. Jung developed this test where you have a list of stimulus words, and you have a subject, a person, and you time them, and you say the one word, and you see how quickly they respond to that one word with another word or a phrase. You write down what they say, and you document how quickly they respond. And this was fascinating to him because this unearthed this idea of having unconscious thoughts and also complexes. So for an example, people would be stunned because you might say mother, and the person might say bitch. Oh, whoops, I didn't mean to say that, I love my mother, right? And it's like, but, why'd you say that then, right? So Freud was very impressed with Jung's writings in particular, and Jung was impressed with Freud's writing, particularly the interpretation of dreams. And so they became really good friends, and learned a lot from each other, and their correspondences fill a whole book that you can read. But they began to have debates with each other, mainly around the focus of sexuality in our psychological makeup. How important is sexuality and sexual energy for us? And for Freud, it's very important. And for Jung, he felt that sex was important, but it wasn't the only thing that drives us. And so Jung writes this particular book called The Psychology of the Unconscious. And that really begins his break with Freud, because in this book, he says that libido, which Freud believed was just sexual energy, Jung says that libido is just psychological energy. That's all it is. And the energy can manifest itself in different ways. Hunger, aggression, love, spiritual experiences. It powers everything. We've got like this psychological generator within us that is bringing forth all of these moods, emotions, instincts, and also fantasies, images, and symbols. I'm not entirely sure of the exact name of the essay, but I know that Crowley wrote an essay where he comments on Freud and Jung and says that it's very important, to read the two of them. And I think he says in this particular essay that Freud, is a little fixated on sex. Just a little bit. And that Jung is good, especially this book, Psychology of the Unconscious, but that he thinks that Jung might be like riding off the rails in the future. Very, very prophetic for him to say that, and you'll see why in a moment. But Crowley was pretty impressed with the depth psychologist, especially Freud and Jung in particular. And so Jung views the psyche as being ego consciousness, then the personal unconscious, and then the collective unconscious. Consciousness is everything that you can think of right now in the present moment. You're conscious of it. Thoughts that come up to you very easily. The personal unconscious is very similar to Freud's idea of the unconscious. This is where it's very personal. It's the things that we have inherited from our parents, from our family of origin, traumatic experiences, but Freud really thought that it was a very nasty, dark place that people are usually don't want to face it at all, and you want to repress it and have nothing to do with it. Jung saw that, there are some scary parts to ourselves, but that it's actually a benefit to really look at those things and examine those things. And then beneath the personal unconscious, there's the collective unconscious. And this is where Jung has the theory of archetypes. And these are things that, this is where his theory to this day is pretty controversial, because it's hard to tell whether he's saying we inherit these things biologically, or whether this is sort of like the equivalent to like, why do birds just know how to build nests? Why do they just know that they're supposed to migrate? You know, when the mother bird doesn't go up to the baby bird and go, okay, this is here's the manual to build a nest 101, right? It's like they just know it. And so these are patterns of experiences that seem to be collective to our entire species. They're impersonal, and yet we experience them in a personal way. So we all have parental figures, and yet the idea of parent is collective. And so there might be an idea of God as an abstract concept, that's an archetype, but how people throughout history and cultures understand what that even means is different. So one thing that he found in his study of both, when he was writing Psychology of the Unconscious, he basically hit the books and he was doing all this comparative mythology, comparative religion research. And during this research, one of the major themes that kept popping up for him was the myth of the hero, but more importantly, sun symbolism. Sun symbolism seemed to be such a universal concept. It was important to so many different cultures, different religions, different mythologies, and he was struck by that significance. And when he later in his life, during the 1940s, started to do research on alchemical texts, he also found that the symbol of the sun was very important in alchemy as well. And it was a symbol of, almost synonymous with the Philosopher's Stone, the process of what he called individuation, which I'll say more in a moment. Any questions about? Yes.
You mentioned the difference between Freud and Jung being that Freud was almost exclusively focused on sex as the drive for everything, and Jung opened it up. Would you say it's also fair to characterize the difference as this, that Freud seemed to want to, like, people are supposed to be at this normal level of functioning in society, and then there's a problem, and for Freud it's all about just, okay, can we analyze things back to the cause? You're always looking back, whereas Jung got to a point where he saw that beyond just getting yourself back up to a normal level of functioning or fitting in, whether that's good or bad, is because of these instincts down below, there's a drive to develop yourself maybe even above the collective level, to go beyond it. So Jung was forward-looking. Freud was just stuck looking behind.
Yes, I 100% agree. And that was another one of Jung's major criticisms of Freud, was to say, oh, so you're having all this aggression. Well, it must have something to do with an early childhood experience. Or, you know, your father was aggressive, wasn't he? You know, or something like that, right? So it was always going backwards, like you said. And Jung didn't deny that that was potentially accurate. I mean, you know, let's face it, a lot of our baggage comes from our parents and our families of origin. But that's not the whole story. And Jung was definitely interested in the progression going forward into the future. It's like, okay, so now you understand that your family of origin, you've had all these traumas and childhood experiences, but now what? I mean, for Freud, the analysis is over at that point. But for Jung, it was like, well, what are you doing in the present? What are you going to be doing in the future? You know, and it seemed to be that there were parts of our psyche that are moving us into the future. And also a common misconception, I don't want to repeat it here because I think I did, so I want to clarify that Freud wasn't just obsessed with sex. I mean, that's like the easiest thing to say about him. And certainly in his early writings, he was. But later on, he did add this concept that Eros is the life force, and that there's the death force. So there's this sort of two opposing forces that are playing tug of war in our psyche. So one is like the will to live, the other one is, you know, destruction or aggression. And how do those two play a part in our psyche? So again, it's, you know, Jung definitely opened it up to a lot more variety of things. But I mean, it wasn't just sex that Freud was talking about.
I'd like to throw out that part about Thanatos, the death urge,
Yeah.
that wasn't Freud's idea all by himself. That was that woman whose name escapes me, Spielrein?
Sabina Spielrein.
Her. I believe that was her idea, and then he took it up.
Yeah, he reduces her to a footnote in his book Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Yeah, she's been really shoved under the rug in the history of psychoanalysis because, well, a lot of really pretentious men were in charge of psychoanalysis for so many years, and so the women were like, oh yeah, she contributed. There's a little footnote right there, but she, very important contributions, and also evidence that she probably helped Jung develop the idea of anima and animus, the feminine masculine principle, but she doesn't get a lot of credit for that either.
And she was murdered by Nazis.
Yes, she was. Any other thoughts or anything like that? So for the longest time, until about 2008, there was this leap in Jung's life in terms of the development of his written thought. I mean, he makes reference in his autobiography, which is called Memories, Dreams, Reflections, about this period after he broke with Freud, where he had this, what he called this confrontation with the unconscious. And he developed this thing called the Red Book. And for the longest time, people were like, okay, yeah, he did this thing. And then there were like some photos of it that surfaced, but no one had really seen it. No one had actually read the content except for like a select small group of people. But in 2008, finally, his grandchildren were convinced that they needed to allow this thing to be published, translated, and so in 2008 it was finally published and translated. And why this is so important is because for the longest time when you read Jung, he writes like you would expect him to write. I mean, he was a psychoanalyst, he was a psychiatrist. And so even when he's talking about religion or spirituality, it's very clinical, it's very psychologically theoretical. And when people would ask him about his personal opinions about metaphysics or anything like that, he said, well, I'm a doctor, I don't talk about things like that. I'm sort of agnostic about these things, Not to say that that's not an appropriate stance to have, but people always kind of scratch their heads and thought, well, yeah, but what does he actually think? What does Jung actually believe about things? Well, in 2008, we found out what he actually believed, or at least we got a little deeper taste of what he might have believed. So the Red Book is this huge text, and he illustrated it. This is actually one of his paintings there on the right. And so he did these paintings in this red bound volume. It's about this big. And he did these paintings and he wrote his dreams and visions in this text. And it's a narrative of essentially his profound spiritual experience, this transformative experience that he had after his break with Freud and right before the beginning of World War I. And it continued for most of the First World War. And so the thing that I want to focus on is actually near the end of the Red Book, which is something that was published at the end of his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is called The 7 Sermons to the Dead. And this occurs, and it's a Gnostic text, at least that he portrayed it as a Gnostic text. He himself wrote it. And it's these 7 sermons, and they're meant to be, they're really out of context. I mean, it's really hard to tell what this thing is. But he says that during one point in the Red Book experience, his whole family experienced very paranormal activity in their home. Like the doorbell was ringing, and they'd open the door and no one would be there. So this is either like, doorbell ditch or, something's going on. But they all claimed to be having these really strange occurrences in the home. And then finally, Jung claimed that he saw ghosts, spirits, who appeared to be Knights Templar coming back from a crusade. And basically telling Jung, look, we went to Jerusalem to find the truth, but we didn't find it there. So we need someone to explain to us what the truth is. And so he does these 7 sermons. And that's the usual narrative, at least how it's portrayed in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. In the Red Book, there's more detail. In the Red Book, Jung saw his self, with a capital S, as being personified by this person named Philemon, who he called the magician. And Philemon, he attributes the deeper parts of his psychological theories to Philemon. So he doesn't say, I, Carl Jung, came up with this. He says, this is this deeper part of myself, this thing that's actually beyond me, taught me these things, and I am now translating it to you, the public, right? And so I didn't go over all the sermons here, but keeping in mind some of the content that we've already gone over, I just want to show some of the parallels between the contents of the sermons and the previous slides. So in Sermon 2, he talks about the union of opposites, and he talks about the image of God and the devil. So he's talking to these Templar ghosts who are presumably Orthodox Christians and saying, okay, so your idea is that there's God and there's the devil. But then he says, yeah, but these two images, when they're unified, create this transcendent image or idea, which is Eros, which is an image that represents both the greatest good and also the greatest evil, but that's life. So this transcendent symbol is life and everything that happens in life, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So really, the greatest image, one of the images for this great symbol is the sun, Eros, love, the tree of life, and also the devil. These four are the principal images that make up this super image. And he also teaches that there's phallos, sexuality, and spirit, that these are energies that are within us, within our psychology, that it's not just one drive over the other, but all these things make up our psychological functioning. And this is something that is parallel to the commentary that's on the Gnostic Mass. So you have discussions about, is it sexual energy? Is it just psychological energy? Spiritual energy? Is it all of these things? But Jung describes our psyche operating in the same way that Crowley and the commentaries on the Gnostic Mass, how they describe what's going on there in the Mass. And most importantly, the most profound image for the self is the inner star. So yes, the sun is there, but it is that within us, there is this star in each person. Does that sound familiar? Right? And it's something that I agree with what Ben said in one of his writings. What's amazing is that we know that Crowley read Jung. We know at least he read Psychology of the Unconscious and he read Freud. What we don't have any evidence for is Jung reading Crowley. So I find it pretty amazing that both of these men hit these exact same ideas. Yes, Jung would eventually translate these profound ideas into psychological writing, Crowley translating it into magical writing, mystical writing, but to me, these parallels are rather profound. So I'll pause there. Any thoughts or reflections on any of that? Yes.
I don't know how to say his name correct. Paracelsus or Paracelsus? Do you know? Neither?
Depends on who's treated with the last.
Oh, okay, I'm going to say Paracelsus. So I think Paracelsus also talks about an inner star.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, the Seven Sermons of the Dead, that would have been written around the late 1910s?
Yes. Yes.
Right.
World War I would still have been going
Okay,
on.
so Jung may not started it. I don't think Jung had started reading The Alchemist or Paracelsus at that point.
No,
So
not
that's
yet.
another coincidence.
Yes, and in fact, I'm glad you pointed that out because it isn't until after he comes out of this experience and well until about, I think, the late 1920s, early 30s, is when he has a friend named Richard Wilhelm sends him a Chinese alchemical text called The Secrets of the Golden Flower. And he starts reading that and he goes, whoa, I've had these same thoughts, and here's this alchemical text. And then he tells this bookseller, you know, if any alchemical texts come through your store, you tell me, because I'm going to buy them, right? Put them on hold for me. And he amasses this very large alchemical library. And then he devotes about 3 whole volumes of his collected works to analyzing alchemical works from a psychological perspective. Another thing also is he had a dream between the Red Book experience and then having this Chinese text sent to him. He has a dream, Jung has a dream, where he's in his house and he sees a door that he's never seen before in his house. And he opens it, and inside there's like a laboratory and with beakers and strange items that he's not really familiar with, and there's this library, these books, and he goes, well, what is this? He starts pulling off these books off the shelf, and he's looking at these books and he doesn't understand what he's reading at all. But then later on he discovered, by being exposed to alchemy, that it was alchemical texts that were in his dream, but he had never seen alchemical texts prior to that moment. So he had this precognition dream, but it's fascinating. So yes, I'm glad you pointed that out. Thank you. Any other? Oh, yes.
How did you choose the picture?
How did I choose the picture? The sun, really. I mean, have you ever seen the images before? Yeah, I mean, I was hard pressed to narrow it down to one. Oh, and we have thank you, Keith, thank you. And we have a copy here. I didn't even know that. That's awesome.
Recent donation to the Grady.
That is so great. Yeah.
Library.
So yeah, this is. I was just wondering if we had one in the library, and that's great. Let's see. Yeah. So I mean, you can see that it's just. It was hard just to pick one image, but I went with the one that was closest to the sun, I suppose. Yeah. So, this is Philemon, by the way. So this is the personification of his self, the self. So I wanted to end my talk with, not like you should do these things, but this is what I have found helpful for myself, because I really think looking at symbolism, meditating on symbols, has been very important in my life, in particular, understanding myself, motivating me. And so these are the ways in which I've been able to do that that's been helpful. And so, I've kept a journal and a dream diary, and what I do is I don't separate them. And I've told people that sometimes, and they go, what? You have them all in the same journal? What's wrong with you? Like, I didn't know there was like a dream diary journal ethic. I'm sorry in advance. But yeah, so I write my conscious, like, this is what I did, blah, 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 and then I write down my dreams in there too, so I can kind of go back and I can see like what was going on in my life when the dreams were occurring. And I found that to be very helpful. Jungian analysis and psychotherapy. I mean, yes, I'm a psychotherapist in training, so obviously I have to plug this as a thing that, like, but I'm actually in my own personal, I'm actually in my own personal Jungian analysis, and it's been really great for me to unpack, really profound dreams and things like that. Attend the Gnostic Mass. Or any sort of ritual that you feel has special symbolic significance for you. Liber Riche, or any sort of contemplative prayer meditation that invokes imagery for you. David Shoemaker's book, Living Thelema, if you haven't read it, is a great book. That was one of the first books that I read about Thelema. And in that book, he talks about, ways in which you can visualize imagery when you're doing the solar prayers. And to me, I think that's awesome, because it's just, you're not just repeating something you've memorized, you're really, really using your imagination to really tune into these symbols and this energy, which I think is really important. At least I found that important for myself. And then comparative study. I'm a hardcore nerd when it comes to these things, and I think that it's just awesome when you start to see the parallels that exist with these different thinkers throughout different points in history. I don't really know what it means exactly. I'm rather agnostic about what it could mean, but I think it's really exciting to see the different parallels. And I think certainly that there's some sort of universal historical language that we as humans are engaging in when we think about comparative symbolism. So those are the things that I would just put out there as what's been helpful for me and might inspire you as well. Any other questions or thoughts? This is my last slide, I think. So. Okay. Well, one thing that Tom wanted me to plug is if you found this interesting, tomorrow at our Hillside Swedenborg Church in El Cerrito, I'm actually giving a talk at 7:30 on the spiritual and psychological implications of Jung's Red Book. So I'm going to go into much more detail about the Red Book, and so free of charge, and you're all invited if you'd like to attend and brave the weather once again. But I want to thank Ben so much and for having me, and Rose for messaging me and saying, hey, do you want to do this? So thank you.